I'm really delighted to introduce the topic of our lecture today, as well as our speaker, who is one of my favorite LDS thinkers. And really, I'm excited that you'll get a chance to learn from her today. The title of the lecture today is The Third Story, Global Dimensions and the Pitfalls of Latter-day Saint Life. And I will let Melissa explain more about that topic and what is meant by the third story. But Melissa Wei-Tsing Inouye is an academic by background. She is a senior lecturer in Asian Studies at the University of Auckland in New Zealand and a historian at the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She studies the history of religion in China, global charismatic Christianity, and Latter-day Saint history. Dr. Inouye is the head of the Global Mormon Studies Research Network and the recipient of the LDS International Society's Distinguished Service Award. As I was talking with Melissa earlier, she mentioned that her family has a very long history at BYU, and that many of her relatives all graduated in university studies, which is a degree that means that you studied anything you want, essentially. Couldn't figure out what you wanted to study, and has deep ties in her family to BYU. We're really delighted to welcome Dr. Inouye to our lecture series today. Please join me in welcoming her with a round of applause.
I pushed a button. Oh, there we go. Thanks so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here and such an honor to speak at the Kennedy Center. I remember I was doing I think I was here as a kind of post-undergraduate but pre-graduate student doing some work at the Smith Institute, and I was here in the summer of 2003, right before I got married, doing a research paper on plural marriage. So it was like the first time I had ever learned about plural marriage. And I was, engaged to my fiance, who was a student here at BYU. And so throughout that summer, I would just be walking along, and I'd suddenly just punch him. And he'd be like, "Ah, what was that for?" And I'd be processing. I have a lot of fond memories of it, and I came to many lectures here in this room during that summer. So I have fond memories of being here, and I'm really happy that I can have this opportunity to speak. So a young Latter-day Saint. A young Latter-day Saint woman in her 20s, a kind, hardworking person who wants to follow Jesus, once said to me, "Church is hard. I'm exhausted. I'm barely holding on. With all the things that feel wrong about the church, how can you in good conscience stay?" I've thought about this question a lot. I know how it feels to be exhausted and barely holding on, and I know how it feels to wonder if you're in the right place. I wonder today if how you can stay is, how can you stay? It is not quite the right question, or at least not the only question, for a person who wants to follow Jesus or live a life in service of God. I remember one question that stuck in my heart when I was 16, an exchange student in Nuremberg, Germany. Nuremberg was a site of the post-World War II war trials where the Allies tried and punished Nazi officers who had committed war crimes, including the atrocities of the Holocaust. As I ran along the charming streets of the old city, I imagined how the city had looked just 50 years ago. I imagined shards of glass from broken shop windows strewn in the gaps between the cobblestones on the morning of Kristallnacht, after Kristallnacht, or red swastika flags hanging down from the beautiful old buildings around Nuremberg's famous Christmas market. On Sundays, I took the subway to church. The sacrament meeting speaker on my first Sunday asked a simple question as the theme of the talk. Bin ich der Hüter meines Bruders? Am I my brother's keeper? The simple language of that question was by far the easiest thing about the talk to understand. When he delved into details, I often got lost. But then once more he would pause, and with a sincerity that bordered on looking deeply troubled, he would ask again, "Bin ich der Hüter meines Bruders?" Why was he so troubled, I thought? Of course the answer is yes. I should be my brother's keeper. At that time in my life, I was a go-getter student, and the most important thing was to come up with the correct answer. Now I realize the right answer to the question is easy, but acting on it, seeing to the safety and well-being of fellow beings, is truly troubling. This question shows up in the 4th chapter of Genesis with the archetypal account of Cain and Abel. Here we have the first story of clashes between the cultural ways of life, herders versus farmers, of younger siblings displacing older siblings, and a perception of zero-sum dynamics as people compete for God's attention. Scholar Robert Alter's translation of Genesis reads, "And it happened in the course of time that Cain brought from the fruit of the soil an offering to the Lord. And Abel too had brought from the choice firstlings in his flock. And the Lord regarded Abel and his offering, but he did not regard Cain and his offering. And Cain was very incensed, and his face fell." That's Genesis chapter 4, 4 through 5. Now, according to this account, it was Cain's relationship with God that was partly at issue. It wasn't that Cain didn't have a relationship with God. They talked. That'd be nice. Cain was accustomed to God's presence. Cain craved God's approval. The issue was Cain was jealous of Abel's relationship with God. Perhaps Cain believed that Abel was an inconsiderate twerp whose flocks trampled the crops and didn't deserve God's approval. Perhaps he believed eliminating Abel and Abel's types of offering would put his own gifts and offerings at the forefront. So Cain murdered his brother. And when God asked him, "Where is Abel your brother?" Cain replied, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" The story of Cain and Abel is the third story in the Bible. In the first story, God creates the world. In the second story, Eve and Adam start out in the safety and innocence of the Garden of Eden, but make the choice to shoulder the burden and opportunity of agency and enter the full range of mortal experience. The third story, including the first people like you and I properly born on earth, shows the first big mistakes, violence within the human family, the very first babies born in the world, a stain of bloodshed in this first generation born into the covenant of Eve and Adam had made with God. Already humanity was making the kinds of mistakes that caused God to weep, as in Moses chapter 7. "Behold these thy brethren, they are the workmanship of mine own hands, and I gave unto them their knowledge, and in the day I created them. And in the Garden of Eden gave I unto man his agency. And unto thy brethren I have said, and also given commandments, that they should love one another, and they should choose me their father. But behold, they are without affection, and they hate their own blood." So in some ways, the third story, the story of how people with different positionalities and experiences struggle with each other over valued resources, in this case God's approval, and also power, is the only story in the history of humankind. The story didn't have to end with murder and separation. Cain could have humbly asked God, "What lack I yet?" Abel could have noticed Cain was missing out on sacrifices and offered him a lamb. But always there is the potential for things to go badly wrong. What do we do with our agency? Will we seek to enrich others and make their lives full? Or will we see life as a zero-sum game in which others must lose in order for us to win? In some ways, the question from the third story is the only question that matters to us in this mortal state. Am I my brother's keeper? I say this because of what Christ said when people asked him about the greatest commandment, recorded in Matthew 22, Mark 12, and Luke 10. Now, throughout centuries, disciples of Christ have sought to understand, interpret, and act on these two great commandments. If we take Jesus at his word, they are, in a sense, the whole point, the key to everything. No pressure there. I won't claim to be able to authoritatively explain exactly what Jesus meant when he gave us the key to everything, because I wasn't there. I have to rely on what early Christians recorded, handed down, canonized, and translated into my language, English. So this is just my personal interpretation, but please bear with me. Please bear with me, even though you might interpret these verses differently, because these passages shape my view of our global relationships. As I study this moment in Jesus' life, focusing primarily for this reading on the account in Matthew, I note that all the three questions put to Jesus in this chapter were, like the question Cain put to God, asked in bad faith. In this case, Jesus had challenged the moral authority of the Jewish religious establishment. Instead of feeling humbled by his criticisms, they sought to eliminate him by tricking him into saying something controversial. Essentially, they gave him three multiple-choice questions, setting up the choices so that however he answered, they could find something wrong about it. Now, Matthew's telling, 3 times Jesus stymies them by answering in a way that sidesteps their assumed value judgments and also opens up a new set of questions. For instance, in response to the politically fraught question, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Jesus broadens the sense of obligation. In addition to giving Caesar what is Caesar's, we should also think, what do we owe God? Then the Sadducees ask a complicated hypothetical question about a postmortal marriage situation. Who gets the wife? Husband 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7? Instead of staying within their narrow possession-oriented question and naming a winning husband, Jesus teaches more broadly about the character of God. He responds, God is not a heavenly policy, but a living presence, a being who responds to the earthly cares and difficulties of the likes of troubled, flawed people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Finally, there's a third question in which a lawyer of the Pharisees asked him, which commandment in the law is the greatest? In the context of ongoing factional debates within Jewish scholarship, this question is also extremely fraught. Jesus cites Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 through 5, from a famous passage known as the Shema that was central to Israelite liturgy and life. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. If this were Jesus' only multiple choice answer, it would be pretty strategically smart. Clearly, God is the source of all laws and is all powerful, and everyone wants to obey and love God. But Jesus doesn't stop there. As in the case of the two other trick questions, Christ's response blows the question open and expands what's at stake for the listeners. He cites Leviticus 19:18 and elevates it as a commandment similar to the first in authority and importance. And the second is likened to it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. By presenting both verses as a set of similar commandments, Jesus has taken the position, shared by other schools of Jewish rabbis, that holiness is found not only in relationships between God and humans, but between humans and humans. And by claiming that all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments, Jesus elevated sacred relationships. Now, to be clear, Jesus wasn't saying love is more important than keeping the commandments in a way that separated love as a human impulse, fundamentally different from God's directives to humans. Jesus was saying the two projects of loving God and loving your neighbor are similar. Not only do you have to love God with everything you have, you also must love your neighbor in that same way. Now, these two commandments were already part of Jewish scriptures, but throughout the course of his mortal ministry, Jesus developed and furthered and made central this teaching on the divine dignity of human beings. It comes through in the Sermon on the Mount, when Christ admonishes people not to curse or to seek to destroy their enemies, but to pray for them, and to treat others the way they themselves would like to be treated. It comes through at the Last Supper when Christ says, "A new commandment I give unto you, as I have loved you, love one another." It comes through in the radical, hopeful, and frankly somewhat scary teaching that Christ gave at the end of his ministry, which is that there is an equivalence between his divine, perfect self and the most downtrodden, least privileged, most problematic human beings on earth. As you have done it unto the least of these, you have done it unto me. A similar equivalence between actions toward God and actions toward human beings is set up in the Book of Mormon, in which King Benjamin testifies, when you are in the service of your fellow beings, you are only in the service of your God. Thus, kindness to someone who is bitter is kindness to Christ. Injury to someone who is marginalized is injury to Christ. Ignorance of someone whose difficulties are easy to forget is ignorance of Christ. Forgiveness of someone who has harmed you is forgiveness of Christ. This is, of course, an impossible standard for most of us to consistently achieve. But I think most of us have had some experience in our lives in which we have succeeded in obeying this most difficult, though basic, of the Savior's commandments. In these moments of seeing as Christ sees, ministering to others with Christ's love, we feel Christ's peace. It feels like a miracle, a pearl of great price. I'd like to tell some stories about Latter-day Saints whose experiences intersected with this question, am I my brother's or sister's keeper, and who drew strength from their obedience to Christ's two great commandments. The stories come from the Gospel Histories, which can be found in the Church History part of the Gospel Library app or church website, and are a fantastic resource, as you will see. These stories also give us insight into the varied trials and challenges faced by Latter-day Saints around the world. Whenever I struggle with the misalignment between my ideal platform of what the church should be and how the church is in real life, it helps me to consider the global dimensions of my religious community. I'm an American woman with an advanced degree and have a particular set of preferences and concerns based on my personal experiences. But what are the odds that my spiritual platform is going to perfectly fulfill the needs of Latter-day Saints in Taiwan or Madagascar or anywhere, any Latter-day Saint who's not me, who have their own religious expectations stemming from their cultures, societies, and experiences, which shape them as significantly as mine have shaped me. So let's do a little visualization exercise. If President Nelson called you up and deputized you to be in charge of the church, what are the first two changes you'd enact? Just imagine these two planks in your personal platform floating overhead. Perhaps when two like ideas in this room get close to each other, they combine and get bigger. But what about others in the audience who have different or opposite concerns? Perhaps when their personal planks get close to yours, they start bumping against each other. Maybe they cancel each other out with a bug zapper type of noise or even a little explosion. What should you do about these people whose views and perspectives compete with your own? If possible, would you make them disappear? As the ancient story of Cain and Abel makes clear, in the presence of others who are fundamentally different, certain tendencies and assumptions arise easily in the natural self. The tendency to see sisters and brothers who have a different lifestyle or culture as fundamentally different, alien. The assumption of zero-sum dynamics, the desire to eliminate the competition, to not suffer fools, to say, I win, you lose, and now it's just me and God. And everything is awesome. or a less socially violent option, to check out and walk away. Why should I have to be that brother's keeper? In light of Christ's teaching, that we have to love the competition, the fools, and the losers as ourselves, such an attitude of pruning away people we don't want to live with from the sacred community does not get us where Christ has asked us to be. It can get us a rest from people who exhaust us. And to be clear, everyone deserves rest. Rest is built into God's process. Sometimes we just need space, peace, and quiet, and I get that. And if there are people in the audience today who cannot hear one more injunction to do better, try harder, give more, because you feel truly depleted and there's no refill in sight, it's okay. Just say, sorry, Melissa, not today, and take a sabbatical for as long as you need it. Now, why in the book of Moses did God weep? God is all-knowing, all-powerful. God is probably the very definition of mature, even-keeled, and resilient. Yet God wept, powerfully affected by the mistakes and harms committed by God's children. The fact that God feels full of sadness when confronted with difficult humans, yet is still God, tells me that it's okay to feel that the burdens of caring about and caring for many others can be heavy. We don't always have to be serene and put together. Yet despite the difficulty of his commandments, Jesus promised, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. As with the people of Limhi in the Book of Mormon, Christ will strengthen us to be equal to the burden we bear. Moroni chapter 7 promises that if we ask for it, we can be filled with love. I have found in my life that when you reach for it, there is always more love. In 1994, when Rwanda was torn by ethnic conflict and hundreds of thousands of killings over the course of a few months, hold on a second. Agnes Twagira Maria was only 11 years old. She witnessed the neighbor kill her parents, 4 of her siblings, and several of her extended family members. For the next 12 years, she struggled with the trauma of her family members' deaths. To lose my family, especially my parents, Agnes said, is a very bad thing in my life, and it had caused some behaviors like being alone, to hate people, to be unhappy for some time with a broken heart. In 2006, now 23, studying at the University of Kigali, Agnes Twagira Maria became roommates with her cousin Yvonne, who was a member of the church. Agnes became curious and eventually began to attend church meetings. The first thing that attracted me was the teachings, Agnes said later. The other thing is the behavior of some church members. They behave like children of the Lord. Agnes was baptized June 13, 2010. In 2012, Agnes traveled to Johannesburg, South Africa to attend the temple for the first time and be sealed at her deceased parents and siblings for eternity. While loss will always be a part of her life, Agnes found healing through the restored gospel. She said, I made changes in my life and I can be happy for a long time. I am peaceful with a forgiving heart. I am able to forgive those killers of my family. For me, forgiveness is a gift I've received after understanding the gospel. The true Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints became my bridge to leaving the life of confusion to the life of truth, from the sadness to the real happiness, from sorrow to joy, from anger to forgiveness. Christ, through his invitation to obey the 2 great commandments, stretched Agnes beyond what many of us might imagine to be the limits of human sympathy. By accepting Christ's invitation to love and forgive her enemies, Agnes found that this additional work was actually a gift that restored her to herself. She found her way to this discipleship through the examples and support of fellow Latter-day Saints. Another Latter-day Saint who is working to respond to the Great Commandment with action is Olivia Sarabira, who served as a Relief Society president in the Mango Ward in Uganda. She has mobilized fellow Latter-day Saints and community members to establish the Peace and Hope Training Center, a nonprofit organization. Beginning in 2006, Olivia focused on providing academic and vocational training for poor children denied basic education. In 2007, Peace and Hope began sheltering young homeless girls and providing counseling as well as education. In 2009, Olivia started a garden program teaching 200 families how to grow a variety of nutritious vegetables in sacks. Under Olivia's program, each family that was trained in sack gardening was obligated to help their neighbors start their own sack garden. This principle of training trainers set in motion a chain reaction of people sharing new skills. Peace and Hope Training Center continued to expand. Trainees learned to use computers, bake bread, and make a variety of goods, including soap, banana fiber hats, and reusable sanitary pads. The center also teaches literacy in English, Swahili, and French, and offers maturation clinics that teach young girls about women's health and the prevention of HIV. Olivia is undaunted by the fact that many of the center's trainees come with very few educational or economic resources. We help that person do more, she said. Olivia says, the main aim of Peace and Hope is to improve people's lives, especially the girl child. Our mission is to foster community-based initiatives that promote charity, solidarity, and social justice, which could later become instruments of development in the entire country, or in the entire East Africa, or the entire Africa, or the entire world. I love the creep of Olivia's ambitions for development. Like Christ before the Pharisees, she is unsatisfied with finding a single answer to a single locally defined question. She can't help busting everything open to get bigger and bigger, the community, the country, Africa, the world. It's easy for her to think big because she is already part of the church's worldwide fellowship. Finally, there's a story of Clara Paz in Peru. In 1982, several children, Marino, Lucio, Alejandro, Marcelina, Maria Lourdes, and Lourdes, Clara, and Mauricio lived with their parents in a small village in the Andes Mountains. They grew their own food and raised a few animals. One day, members of the terrorist group Shining Path came into the village and executed 21 locals, including the oldest brother, Marino. A week later, in the middle of the night, a group of militants brutally killed the father, Moises, and mother, Graciela, in front of their children. Mauricio, then 3 years old, remembers as his father lay dying, he asked him for a drink of water and told him not to cry. Lucio, age 15, went to Lima to find work. He finally secured a job harvesting sweet potatoes. His 5 siblings soon joined him. For a while, they lived with an aunt, but she wasn't able to care for them. She gave them a small plot on which they built a little structure. For years, their main staple was sweet potatoes, eaten raw, because they didn't have matches or any equipment to cook them. They frequently went to outdoor markets after closing time to collect food that had fallen on the ground. On one of these days, Clara remembers she was standing in front of a fruit stand. The owner asked, "What are you doing?" "Looking," she answered. He asked her why. "Because I'm hungry," she said. He filled the bag with fruit. She took it home and shared it with her brothers and sisters. Lucio saw 2 missionaries on the street one day and remembered that he and Alejandro had been baptized before their parents had been killed. He ran after the missionaries and they told him where to find the church. For a period of time, a senior missionary couple from the United States, Shirley and Verlin Anderson, took special care of them. They helped the bishop of the local ward create an apartment for them on the 3rd story of his house. Today, the DePaz siblings have been sealed to their parents. Clara says, "It is the gospel that has kept us united." She says also, "I have helped many people because some angels helped us without knowing us. I have followed this example because I was blessed with a little more money." Clara's experience of loss and want, and her experience of being cared for by others made her leap to be her brothers and sisters' keeper as soon as she was able. Just as the sharp-eyed fruit seller in her childhood had suspected a need and addressed it, we can be observant and proactive in looking out for fellow children of God. What do all 3 of these global histories have in common? They show Latter-day Saints up against some of the worst and most trying aspects of mortality, which many of us in developed, wealthy countries will never experience: genocidal violence, lack of basic education, childhood malnutrition, and severe food insecurity. I don't want to minimize challenge that I have experienced along with others, such as being a female academic at a research university where men are promoted to full professor at much higher rates than women, or being a cancer patient moving from one cutting-edge clinical trial to another. But the challenges of the saints in these stories are of a different dimension and magnitude entirely. I feel very humbled considering the role of the gospel in my life alongside their stories of faith and power. The stories also show the power of Latter-day Saint networks, both local and international. Church members draw on these networks for support in improving their own lives and helping others. Bound together by overlapping ties of sacred covenants, volunteer assignments, joint recreation, meeting culture, and shared foodways, our religious ties transcend ethnic and national differences. In February of this year, as Russian bombs began to fall in Ukraine, I was touched by a newspaper story about a Ukrainian Latter-day Saint, Katya Serdyuk, a translator for the church. She is also a volunteer administrator for the BYU Pathways Worldwide program and was regularly in contact with Latter-day Saint students from Moscow and Siberia. The day after the bombing began, she found herself in a meeting with many of these Russian students. The Russian students expressed concern for her and apologized for what was going on. She reflected later, "I just couldn't look at them like my enemies." Connection takes collective work, which work can often go awry. It benefits from organization, which can often become bureaucratic, corporatized, and often feel soulless. It creates culture, which can often become a constraint. It recruits a lot of people who are sometimes horrible. Yet despite all these hazards springing from the constant of human imperfection, there are ways in which connection can create refuge and generate strength in difficult times. In these connections and gatherings, as we follow Christ's call to respond fully to the humanity of others on a person-to-person scale, ignoring the whims and lusts of the nation or other armed tribes, there lies the greatest hope for peace on earth. What do we do about the times when we fundamentally disagree, when we can't speak each other's languages, when we're not even in each other's field of vision? Many issues that divide us as a global body of saints sorry, I had a that, and it ruined my sentence. Many issues divide us as a global body of saints. For instance, on the question of LGBTQ issues, policies that are more liberal on the global spectrum for this issue would make many groups of Latter-day Saints in Europe, would make many groups of Latter-day Saints in the United States and Europe think this feels right. but would make other populations of Latter-day Saints in Asia, Latin America, and Africa think this feels wrong. These sharp differences in moral common sense stem from the diversity inherent in global culture. Once an organization has grown to a certain scale, large enough to encompass a meaningful segment of human diversity, fixing a social issue in one place will inevitably break it in another. There is no way to magically homogenize these differences. We must simply find ways to work with them. In Ghana in the 1970s, a young woman named Priscilla attended an Anglican college in Mampong. Sorry, not this one. One day she had a dream in which she met Jesus while he was carrying the cross. His face and eyes were covered with blood and tears. He asked Priscilla for a handkerchief to wipe his face so he could see. "I will do that, my Lord," she promised. Priscilla and her husband, John Sampson Davis, were among those baptized when the first missionaries came to Ghana in 1978. One Sunday morning in 1980, Priscilla was relaxing at home when she had another visionary experience. She saw herself in sacrament meeting. She was approached by a figure in white who asked her to look around and tell him what she saw. She noticed that many in the congregation had bowed heads and did not join in singing. When he asked her why, she replied they did not speak English. He asked if she would be willing to help her brothers and sisters so they too could join in singing praises to our Heavenly Father. When this vision ended, Priscilla immediately took up paper and pencil and began translating the hymn, Redeemer of Israel, into her native language of Fante. She soon read an article in the Ensign magazine about the Book of Mormon being translated into another language. She heard a voice whisper, "Couldn't you do that too?" She soon translated the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price, and other church materials into Fante. Priscilla thought of the scripture, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me." She felt that by translating hymns and scriptures so the people of Ghana could see, she fulfilled her promise to give the Lord a handkerchief. Like Priscilla, we can look around us and notice those in our congregations and worldwide church communities who, for whatever reason, are not joining in singing, find it hard to join in singing, and we can do something about it. Enlarging the stakes of Zion, therefore, and widening the tent is something that takes place at the ground level. In 1993, General Relief Society counselor Chieko Okazaki said, "If you experience the pain of exclusion at church from someone who is frightened at your difference, please don't leave. You may think you are voting with your feet, that you are making a statement by leaving. Some may see your diversity as a problem to be fixed, as a flaw to be corrected or erased. If you are gone, they don't have to deal with you anymore. I want you to know that your diversity is a more valuable statement." The flip side of this, increasing diversity by staying put, is that we can also foster diversity by ranging far and wide with our questions and letting our answers lead to something concrete. What are the assumptions of my culture and society? Where are my blind spots? What do my sisters and brothers want and need? Where do we find significant differences, and how can we live with them? In India today, as the research of Tonal and Rutherford has shown, although Latter-day Saint meeting houses are largely casteless spaces with Brahmins cleaning toilets and members of scheduled castes serving in stake presidencies, many Indian Latter-day Saint families still prefer to arrange marriages for their children with families from similar caste backgrounds. The system of youth dating prescribed in For the Strength of Youth feels immoral. It feels unacceptable. The research of Caroline Klein on Latter-day Saint women in Botswana details how in Setswana culture, having children is seen as an unmitigated good, no matter whether the mother is married or unmarried, and how extended families and communities share in the care of children. Therefore, on one occasion, the woman of an urban relief society vocally and forcefully rejected a directive from church headquarters in the U.S. that if a single woman falls pregnant, she should put the baby up for adoption. One relief society member recounted, "Before the bishop even finished what he was delivering, the message from headquarters, the sisters were up in arms saying all sorts of things. They were like, 'No, maybe our minds and hearts were not prepared. Or maybe we feel this way because we're Africans and we are taught that a child is a gift from God and it doesn't matter if they come out of wedlock or not, that one has to treasure them and keep them.' Given the cultural and generational differences the church faces, exacerbated by worldwide growth and the fact that culture is changing faster and faster at the same time that people are living longer and longer, I have no idea what the future holds. I am relieved I am not the one steering the ship. But I'm convinced that if you take this question seriously, am I my brother's or sister's keeper, along with Christ's answer, being a Latter-day Saint is an extremely productive way to respond to these moral and divine imperatives. We, the Latter-day Saints, can work to be better. We can figure out how to model Christ-like love with meaningful acts instead of just well-meaning words. We can learn to grapple with racism, sexism, and nationalism in our history, just as Germans have successfully confronted their darkest days and found new ways to build their culture and community. We can open our eyes to new visions of Zion. With all of our laws and policies hanging on these two great commandments alone, we do not have to worry that being a Latter-day Saint means being a customer in a cafeteria compared to swallow whatever the house menu dictates. Being a Latter-day Saint, in fact, means farming, gathering, hunting one's own food, cooking and tasting and sharing it with others. It's your church too. What will you do with it? But also, what unexpected things will your brothers and sisters call you to do? What unexpected selves will your community call you to become? What unexpected pits will you fall into and learn how to get out of because of your entanglement in our large global community? If we keep our eyes on Christ and keep asking the question from Scripture's third story, we can have confidence to keep moving forward. Being a Latter-day Saint ties me to the children of God all throughout the world who are striving to honor the same set of sacred covenants, that to follow Christ, to build Zion for our children and grandchildren. It ties me to people far away and also in my own neighborhood who are my political, cultural, and theological opposites. It ties me not only to their divine siblingships, but also to their contemporary faults, ailments, and quagmires. When we covenanted at baptism to bear one another's burdens, we probably thought about the virtuous burdens like being orphaned or having a chronic illness. But what about the burdens we bring upon ourselves, stemming from bigotry or ignorance or pride? Are we willing to help bear those burdens too, until their owners can put them into the Savior's outstretched hands? The problem of being connected to people all around the world is that large numbers of people do not move anywhere quickly. They do not do anything together easily. But what other alternative do we have if we take the Savior seriously? To whom will we say, the time's not right for us to be brothers and sisters? Recent General Relief Society counselor Sharon Eubank gave a talk quoting Joseph Smith. It grieves me that there is no fuller fellowship. If one member suffer, all feel it. By union of feeling, we obtain power with God. These words hit her like a lightning bolt. Power with God comes from union of feeling. As she puts it, unity doesn't magically happen. It takes work. It's messy, sometimes uncomfortable, and happens gradually when we clear away the bad as fast as the good can grow. Sometimes, she says, even within this well-intentioned collective work at church, each of us is going to have deeply wounding experiences, things that should never happen. Each of us will also, at various times, allow pride and loftiness to corrupt the fruit we bear. And yet, she says, if we aspire to be our brothers and sisters' keeper, we cannot run faster than others have strength to follow, or drop off to the side as others press forward. I have to edit myself there. She didn't say that. I said that. I don't want her to get in trouble for something that I say. Am I my brothers and sisters' keeper? With every new convert baptism, every new mission zone opened, this question becomes more and more problematic for Latter-day Saints who take it seriously. To keep asking takes courage, resilience, fortitude, and patience. But this is the question that will help us to meet Jesus where he has asked us to be. It is the question that will help us grow into the stature of our Mother and Father in heaven, who sent us to earth to learn from each other through various provocations and explorations, who see us all and who hold our lives in their loving hands. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. We're lucky now that we can move into a discussion portion of our afternoon. We have a little over 20 minutes for you to raise your questions and share your ideas with us today. So Laura in the back has a microphone that she can bring to you. So if you are interested in asking a question, please just raise your hand and be patient, and we'll bring the microphone to you. And Melissa, we'll just let you manage your own questions. We'll just aim to finish up at 1 o'clock. Recognize that some of you may need to leave before that for classes, and that's fine if you need to do that. Otherwise, we'll take the next 20 minutes for Q&A.
Didn't have to talk so fast. We have plenty of time. Are there any? Oh, I went to show you. This is what happens when you edit your talk at the last minute, like right before sacrament meeting when you're sitting on the stand fixing things. I just wanted to show you these statistics. These are contemporary. They show severe food insecurity and moderate food insecurity on a global scale. If you compare, so on the right-hand side, we have Northern America and Europe. It exists. But it's nothing compared to what we see going on in other parts of the world. In other parts of the world, we have, huge percentages of people who don't have enough food. Here we have a recent news item. of the church making a $32 million $32 million donation to the World Food Program to face the kind of current looming food security crisis that we have right now. And these big connections are something that you can only do if you're organized, you've got a lot of people together, and if you've worked to have money. So, any questions? Yes.
And introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Sydney Balliff. I am curious, you talked about in your book separation and journeyings, and I was curious if you could expound a little bit on when you felt separated from your institution but connected to your faith practice at the same time.
Separated from my institution but connected to my faith practice at the same time. I think I talk about this in the book, actually. There's let me talk about the first time. So the one of the first the first of my many faith crises, not faith in Jesus, but faith in should I be part of this institution, took place when I was at BYU. I was interviewing for a scholarship. I was with a group of people who were brought in for scholarship because they were good at chemistry and biology, and we were hanging out in the hotel where they had put us up, and I pulled out this book, Doctrines of Salvation, which is a book that's really down on evolution, and I said, what do you guys think about this book? And there was this kind of consternation in the room because there were all these smart high school girls who had worked hard to get good grades in science, and this seemed to be a very anti-science part of the book, and we were just kind of stymied. We thought, how can we, if a major church leader is saying these kinds of things, you can't believe in Jesus and evolution at the same time. What are we doing here? Like this, how is it supposed to work? And that was the first time I felt that kind of confusion and I think alienation that I think a lot of us feel when we have faith crises where we just wonder if if something is wrong, then how can it be not right, but if something's wrong, it feels wrong, then how can it be right? If something is if something feels clearly incorrect, then how can this be good? And I think we feel similar feelings when we hear about there was a bishop in Draper who abused youth in his congregation, or anytime we hear about Latter-day Saints messing up in a major way who are involved with the church institution. I think when those things happen, we feel alienated, or I do. I wonder if we as a Latter-day Saint people are doing things right, and if we've got, if there are things that if there are things that feel wrong, how can this be Christ's church? And I think the answer to that is that if there are people in Christ's church, there will always be things that feel wrong, like really wrong. And I've probably said a lot of those things that have made people feel wrong. So, but it's hard. I think I talk about this in my book as well. I think we have this when I was young, and even today actually, we have a view of a kind of completeness and comprehensiveness that kind of feels really good. Like the whole package is awesome. If the whole package is awesome, then everything is awesome, and we can burst into song like the Lego movie. I used to think about my faith as kind of being like a string of Christmas lights, and you've already read the book, so I'm sorry for saying this again. But like in a string of cheap Christmas lights, if one light gets knocked out, then the whole strand is ruined and the whole thing doesn't work. And sometimes that's how those moments of alienation that I feel are times when I feel like, there's like this bad light and everything feels dark. But that's actually not how religious communities work. That's actually not how religious movements work. We're not a machine. And we're not all put together out of these parts that do things. We are like a sourdough starter, which goes into a bunch of flour and water and salt, and has enzymatic action that works over time as the bacteria are like reproducing and farting out carbon dioxide and having a great time and interacting with each other and competing with other strains of bacteria. It's a very messy, sometimes stinky, living process. And so in those processes, in the people, in the experiences, and most importantly, the relationships of the church, that's the part of my practice where I feel that, in fact, Jesus is here. In fact, God is with us. In fact, our church is led by the Spirit, and this is a place where God wants me to be. That was kind of a long, wandering response. Sorry. Yes, in the second row, and then over there.
So if I understood what you were arguing right, and at least what I took away from it is that when we're confronted with difference about what is real or good or true, the solution should be to worry less about that and worry more about loving the person, which I appreciated. And my question coming out of that is, why do you think the best place to do that, or a good place to do that, is in a community that is institutionally and theologically and culturally very invested in truth and universal truth, and ties the morality of a person explicitly to knowing the right things, when what you're saying is that that's not the thing we should be focusing on, and we should be focusing on the people instead?
Good question. I was actually recently ranting on this very thing, and I don't think that our community necessarily has always defined truth as like this thing that's knowable as opposed to doable. However, the church does come out of the kind of, I think it was affected by this kind of Enlightenment rationalism, this idea that you could know truth could be restored, truth is really important. I feel like for people in the 21st century, those kinds of ideas about, with pretty modern ideas actually, ideas about being able to know truth, like one thing, have kind of broken down. I feel like in the 21st century, people, not just Latter-day Saints, but just people more generally, are more focused on actions, relationships, connections, and networks. So maybe I'm just expressing my own kind of preferences here, but I do think that, Jesus said, if you want to know my doctrine, you should do it. Jesus said, how you treat people, how you do unto other people is the most important thing. Jesus didn't say, like, the first great commandment is to love God, and the second great commandment is to, like, know truth. And truth is, like, big. Truth is hard to talk about. Everyone has an opinion about truth. But I just think that the context of how we talk about truth, shifts over time. I think there was especially a period of time, maybe when I grew up, or maybe when I was a missionary, when there was this idea that like a kind of syllogism, which is also kind of like a Christmas light string, where if the Book of Mormon is true, then Joseph Smith is a prophet, and all these kind of things based on this idea of like truth, like if it's there in this place, then it's there in this place. But I just don't think that. I think in a global era, in a postmodern context, where we understand how people can see things from so many different perspectives, and how something that feels completely true to me feels completely false to someone else, and how perceptions shape what we feel, and how our assumptions about reality shape what we receive as true or good. I just think that the safer way to do what Jesus told us to do is to do truth, as opposed to define or know truth, because who could know truth? This is also kind of tangential, but the other day, in July, I think, when the James Webb Telescope images came out. Who here has seen the James Webb Telescope images? Okay, I had another one of my many faith crises in July when I saw the James Webb Telescope images the picture of a tiny grain of sand, amount of sky, dark sky, that was in fact teeming with galaxies, like bacteria in a petri dish. When I saw that, I thought, if there is a God, I do believe there's a God. If there is a God, there is no way I understand that God. Like, if that God created this, like, there's no way I understand that God. I was kind of thinking maybe like the God of like Earth or something like that. Like, how do you keep track of all the people who've ever lived if you have to like think of more people than Earth, right? But that was just incredible to me. And and so what I've decided is that I have no I have no idea really about like what God wants. Well, that's not true. I have no idea about what God, like, I can't understand God, really. Like, there's no way I understand God in that way. But I have felt the love of God for me. And I felt the love of God for people, like individual people, and for all and groups of people. And I know that one thing that I do know is that through my relationships with people, I can do what God wants me to do. And that's where I most feel the Spirit. That's where I most feel truth, dare I say. Again, a long and rambling answer. There was another question back here in the middle. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Grace Gibson, and I know you talked about growing like holy relationships, not only with God, but with the people surrounding us. And just taking into context, like Dallin H. Oaks, he was here and he talked a couple weeks ago about how we can love God and love our neighbors, but we can't let our love for our neighbors grow between us and us and God. And I was wondering if that's something we should take into consideration when growing those holy relationships with other humans.
Just to repeat your question, you're saying, is it possible for our relationships with other people to come between us and God? I think so. If we have like a horrible, toxic relationship with a person that can fill our lives with toxicity. For example, Agnes Tagira Maria was able to, this loss, this desolation, and this hatred for the people who had killed her family members. That did separate her from God. I think the nature of those two commandments being connected means that they influence each other. Right? They're not like that. That's the whole point of what Jesus was saying, right? They're like unto each other. So how we treat each other does influence our relationship with God, and how other people treat us using their agency can also affect our relationship with God. And I think we're all responsible for those relationships in those multiple dimensions. Was there a question in the back?
Name's Michael. First of all, thank you for all of your words. But as you were talking about the idea of having our ideal changes to the church and all the planks floating around and building and canceling each other out, talked about, us kind of developing our own sort of Cain situation where we want to, get rid of the, people who disagree with us or people who we seem to be having an issue with.
People who are messing up our church.
Exactly. I guess, would you have any advice on being able to recognize when you're starting to develop those feelings and, early on before you get to the point where you start actually, doing anything crazy like, starting arguments online or something like that? Do you have any ideas for being able to start recognizing those times when you have those Cain tendencies?
I think the point is, I like how you put it that way. I think we always have those kind of intellectually murderous tendencies. And so I think that the best way to think about it is like the same way that we think about like how do we deal with like, racism, just to recognize that we're always racist. Like it's always with us. It's never not. And those tendencies to kind of want to like disappear the people who are messing up our church, also always with us, never not. So so when we know that, then I should think about this more often. When we know that, then it's easier for us to just maybe just slow the rants or only rant for 30 seconds as opposed to like 7 minutes, or just it helps us be a little more humble and to think, of how do we live with our significant differences, because they're not going to go away. Cultural differences won't go away. Generational differences will not go away. We've always had them and we'll always have them. So we just got to learn how to live with them. So they're not a catastrophe. They're just how things are. And same thing with contradictions and tensions and difficult things. So again, okay, I'm going to stop. I was going to go on a tangent, but then maybe there's another question. Yes. Oh, sorry. There's right there. And then up here.
Hi, I'm Macy. First of all, I have lived by your words for the past 3 years. And so hearing you say that you've had multiple faith crises is so humanizing and reassuring for someone who thinks a lot about rhetoric and the regurgitation of words used in church and how that can be disappointing and disheartening for people going through faith crises every month, like me. So I just wanted to ask you about how you feel like we can change the rhetoric in our church, and if that has potential to be more humanizing and reassuring for people like us.
What do you mean by change the rhetoric? Like,
Yeah.
not your rhetoric?
Not my rhetoric.
Which rhetoric are you trying to change?
The church leaders' rhetoric.
Church leaders' rhetoric?
Mm-hmm.
We had to take that up with them.
Or even just like in our classes and in our meetings, how we can better communicate our spirituality instead of a regurgitation of rhetoric.
How do we better communicate our spirituality? I like that. That's a very, like I said, I think we are producers of religion as well as consumers of it. And your point about kind of original rhetoric as opposed to just kind of retweeting someone's rhetoric is really significant. And I think we can all kind of take that upon ourselves, like to be more production-oriented or to have... that sounds lame. To have original thoughts. That's not what I mean. But I think you have your finger on that pulse. Researchers who study. Okay, let's think about the human body, for example. So if we were to say only the higher rhetoric of the higher ups is valid, to me that seems kind of like. And I'm not saying you're saying this, but kind of one of the implicit problems in your question is that if we are not a member of this kind of towering bureaucratic hierarchical structure, then like our rhetoric doesn't matter. But I don't think that's true. So, for example, I happen to be standing in front of you with a skeleton and muscles, right? Do I look like I'm doing a great job standing with a skeleton and muscles? But vertical structural things are not the only important parts of a system. I happen to be dying actively because of tumors in my body. And they're like little tiny cells, but they spread. And I'm not trying to say we should all act like cancer tumors, because I hate those so much. But you would be a fool. People would be a fool to say the only important part of being a human being is standing and having a skeleton and muscles, right? So invisible things and systems, or small things at the very small level, are actually extremely consequential in any system, as we know, from our bodies. So I think actually really small rhetoric, as long as it's living, zooming around, and multiplying in a way that's like a nice cell and not a cancer cell, is actually quite useful. So keep it up. Okay, there's a question up here. And maybe this is the last one because we have to go.
You talk a lot about like our global church community, and I was just wondering what are the ways that you've seen ways that our global church community is different from maybe some other global church communities, such as Islam,
Good question.
Catholicism.
Yes, okay, that is a good question. So Catholicism is huge. They're way more global than we are. We can say with a single-digit fraction, like what not percent. That's not a fraction. What proportion of people in the world are Catholic? That's like incredible. However, in some ways, we are more global than they are because we're small and weird. When you're small and weird, then you have a kind of a shared culture. Now, granted, this culture is like very influenced by American culture and corporate culture and all these kinds of things. But we have like temples where we have the kind of shared liturgy. We do these things, and there just aren't as many of us as there are Catholics. And so it's like we see each other more often. We see all of each other more often than the Catholics can. There's no way the Catholics can see all of each other at the same time. But when we come together for general conference, there aren't that many of us. We're 0.02% of the world's population. So in that sense, the globalness of us is easier to see, both for researchers and also like for ourselves to see. And I think you get that also at BYU, with all the ways that people know each other and they're connected to each other, they met each other on their missions or whatever, those kinds of networks. There aren't that many people. If you go to Asia and then you go to sacrament meeting, like for example, like in Beijing, you're going to run into people that basically, just because that's how small that world is. So small and weird is how we are unique, which I think is awesome. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much for your questions and for being with us.